Hey, everybody, welcome to Behind the Headlines. I have another great guest for you. Thanks for joining us. Please make sure to click subscribe, click the bell icon so they notify you, maybe, if we're not suppressed, which we're incredibly suppressed. But, hopefully you'll remember to check. I do these interviews twice a week, talking to amazing people like Richard Wolff and Scott Ritter, Stella Assange, John Shipton, Stephen Donziger, Chris Hedges. And today, another amazing and accomplished person. Andy Lee Roth is the associate director of Project Censored. Hopefully, most of you have heard of Project Censored. And he's the co-editor of the latest edition of Project Censored's annual Top 25 Most Censored Stories, The State of the Free Press. It's an incredible book, an incredibly important one to check out. And we're going to go through, as many of those top censored stories as we can today. So, hello, Andy.
Thanks, Lee. Great to join you on Behind the Headlines. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for being here, and thanks for putting out another excellent edition. How long have you been working with Project Censored?
I started working with Project Censored around 2006, 2007 was the first yearbooks that I had a hand in. I was teaching sociology at Sonoma State University in California, and Peter Phillips was a senior member of the sociology department there, and at the time the director of the project. And he said, you should start doing stuff with Project Censored. He knew as a sociologist, I was interested in the news. Mm-hmm. And so I said, sure, thinking like, I'm junior faculty. This means, next year after I've got my feet on the ground, he'll get me involved. But what Peter meant was like, I'll connect you to a group of Project Censored students and you'll write a chapter for this year's book. And it's like, Peter, I kind of feel like I should just maybe learn a little bit more before I get going. And he was like, no, you'll do great. It'll be fine. And that was in some ways a great introduction to the project in two ways. One is that since its inception in 1976, it's been heavily focused on student education around critical media literacy. Carl Jensen, the founder of the project, was doing that before there was a name for it, before we talked about media literacy or critical media literacy. And the other thing was just kind of Peter's abiding spirit that you don't need to be an expert to begin to analyze the corporate media in critical ways, in critical ways that generate real insights. You don't need to be an expert, you just need to pay attention. And That was the approach with the students at Sonoma State who worked with Project Censored. Most of them weren't aspiring journalists, didn't plan to go to, pursue careers in media necessarily. They were sociologists and oftentimes just taking Peter's course for a general education, to fulfill a general education requirement. But they were politically engaged and they were intellectually interested. And, that's enough to do great work in my experience.
Yeah, I think it would be, because intellectually interested does not sound like something that comes from the mainstream media. So you got to get it elsewhere. How do you guys decide on the top 25?
It's a year-long process that actually, even as this book is just a little bit more than a month old, we're already starting the story review process for the next book. And so it begins with students and faculty in the project's campus affiliates program, identifying and vetting candidate stories. And each, on a regular basis on the Project Censored website, you can find validated independent news stories. These are the candidates for each year's top 25 story list. And in the spring of each year, we gather together all those stories, usually several hundred, from a wide variety of independent news sources. These are all stories on topics that the corporate media is either not covering at all, or topics that, to the best of our ability to determine, they've covered in only a partial way, where partial could mean incomplete and or biased. And in springtime, we begin voting. There are 2 rounds of voting. The first involves all the faculty and students and Project Censored people, and we whittle that story list down from several hundred to about 3 dozen finalists. And those final stories go to our international panel of expert judges who vote to determine the top 25 and to rank order them. So the top 25 thing, just in candor, like the top 25 list is good, and it's a hook for media coverage of these important but underreported stories. But I wouldn't want anyone to think that somehow the number one story is better than, more important. It's not than, say, the number 18 story, right? They're all important. Right. And collectively, I think in some ways, each story is important in its own right. But I think the other thing that's going on is that when you look back, this is now, I think, the 46th cohort of Project Censored students digging stories that the corporate news media have buried or covered in only biased ways, right? So we've got 40 some years of top 25 lists. And to me, as a sociologist, one of the interesting things about that is not the individual stories per se, but the patterns in missed coverage, in the patterns in effect, the blind spots or the gaps in the corporate news media's coverage that you can see when you look across 40 some years of underreported but important stories.
Yeah, and in terms of you saying it's not necessarily more important, that makes sense, because it's how would you rate them? I mean, like something about fossil fuels, the subsidies to fossil fuels, which we'll be talking about. Obviously, that's destroying the planet for our ability to live. So in a way, that's number one. But in another way, it could be that another story is more hidden. Another story is, more nefariously hidden, or that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, and a lot of these stories are linked too, right? At least if you think about them sociologically. So way down at number 20 something on this year's story list is a really important report about how the US transportation system fuels inequality, right? Now that's linked to fossil fuels, right? It's, any time that we invest in roadways, we're in effect indirectly subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, making it easier for people to maintain their dependence on personal cars.
And investing.
I don't want to start a whole debate about whether we ought to have cars or not. But the point is, when you invest in roads that privilege people who are wealthy enough to own and drive their own car, and you don't invest in public transportation, that has consequences that affect people differently depending on where they are located on the kind of socioeconomic hierarchy, right? Poor people get screwed when you don't invest in public transportation. So that story is way down low on the list and almost never gets talked about. So I'm taking an opportunity at the opening here to mention it. But it's also linked to like some of the more prominently placed stories in the list. For instance, the number one story about globally the subsidies that the fossil fuel industry receives from national governments around the world.
Well, we can start with that one since we've brought it up. I did a episode of Most Censored News on this topic because it is so important. But well, I still think we should continue to cover it, continue to talk about it. $11 million. Was it a minute?
Per minute.
Every time I say it, every time I repeat the number, I always go, was that an hour? No, a minute.
Yeah. It's $11 million in government subsidies to the fossil fuel industry every minute. So I haven't been keeping track of how many minutes we've been talking, but in that time, probably close to $100 million have been siphoned to various fossil fuel corporations through national governments around the world. Now, I think the thing that's fun to talk about, especially on a show like Behind the Headlines and as a representative of Project Censored, is the radical source of this study is the International Monetary Fund.
Right.
So that's kind of, it's in other words, it's not some let's dismantle capitalism organization saying these fossil fuel subsidies from national governments are off the hook. It's the IMF saying that. Yeah. I think there are two other things I would say that are important to just note about this story that may duplicate some of the things you've already talked about on the air, Lee. One is that most of those subsidies are in the form of indirect benefits to the fossil fuel industry. So it's the idea, economists talk about this as the efficient price for a good. And the efficient price for oil and other fossil fuel products is significantly lower than it would be because of all these indirect subsidies. And, so this is the lack of liability for things like healthcare costs associated with air pollution, extreme weather events, traffic collisions. All of these are things the fossil fuel industry never pays the bill for these. It's taxpayers and national governments that in effect underwrite what economists would call the externalities of the fossil fuel industry doing business. The other thing I would say is that this was a study of 191 countries, but what the IMF found and what Damian Carrington at The Guardian and Eduardo Galeano reporting for Tree Hugger noted was that 5 nations are responsible for most of these subsidies. And the US is not, perhaps surprisingly, among the leaders. In 2020, the US provided something like $730 billion in subsidies, direct and indirect, to fossil fuel industries. I love this quote from a spokesperson for Oil Change International, one of the activist groups trying to expose and change the dynamics on this issue. It says it's an utter disgrace that rich countries like the United States, Japan, India, and others are continuing to spend more on subsidies for fossil fuel industry than they are on climate protection. Right. So the priorities
by a million.
The priorities are just whack.
Yeah. Yeah, and to give the total number, it's 11 million per minute, or 5.9 trillion in 2020 alone, and
projected to rise to over 6 trillion a couple years from now.
Yeah, and to try and get the human brain around the number 1 trillion, I always like to tell people that if you make $40,000 a year after taxes, to make $1 trillion, you'd have to work for 25 million years. And I feel like that helps put it in perspective a little bit. It's just
unbelievable. Part of, I think, why these stories don't get the traction they deserve is that the figures are just, they're astonishing figures that it's almost hard for art. So I think that's a very useful analogy.
Yeah, and yet it also, these subsidies also always stick with me, because we always talk about how we don't, we don't have money for things. We don't have money to pay for healthcare. We don't, or even if you want to stick with energy, we don't have money to create, the solar cells to switch off fossil fuels. But of course, we're subsidizing fossil fuels to begin with.
Yeah, right. So all the kind of supposed free market advocates who are saying, oh, well, we're messing with the invisible hand when we subsidize green energy, solar, and the like. Again, those are just specious arguments, because the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry to continue business as usual when we're facing an existential climate crisis, that any subsidies that have been proposed in the US for things like solar panels are tiny drops in the bucket compared to the $11 million a minute that we're talking about.
Let's jump to another important story that I have heard almost no coverage of outside of your top 25. Number 3 on your list is that the EPA withheld reports on dangerous chemicals.
Yeah, this sounds like another really bad news story, but I love talking about this one, Lee, because there's there's an important angle to it about the significance, the potential positive impact of independent investigative journalism. So I'll cycle back to that after some bad news.
Okay.
So yeah, the EPA between January of 2019 and November of 2021, the EPA withheld, so I believe the figure is 1,240 reports about dangerous chemicals. These are known as Section 8E reports, and in the lingo, they are about substantial risk to either human health or the environment. And Sharon Lerner, reporting at The Intercept, found that in that time period, all but one of these 1,240 substantial risk 8E reports were basically deep sixed. They weren't. The EPA failed to report them to the public. Normally, usually the EPA would post several hundred of these Section 8E reports a year, but again, starting around January 19, they disappeared. There's not direct evidence on this, but the chemical industry has long resisted any kind of negative reporting or oversight by government organizations like the EPA on the grounds that these, compromise industry trade secrets, intellectual property rights, and that sort of thing. So they've consistently sought to avoid any kind of rulings or regulations that would require disclosures of the sort that the EPA has historically undertaken. Now we're beginning to shift into where it becomes a kind of good news. So Sharon Lerner at The Intercept reports on this, right? Mm-hmm. That partly empowers a bunch of people at PEER, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, to begin undertaking a lawsuit based on Freedom of Information Act requests. That happens in around January of 2022, last year. E.A. Crunden of E&E News reports on the PEER lawsuit. And lo and behold, a month later, the EPA resumes posting these Section 8E substantial risk reports. So there's I think a kind of often at Project Censored, we're talking about cautionary tales. This is, I think, right, a kind of laudatory tale, right? Investigative journalists working together with government employee whistleblowers through PEER basically forced the EPA to do what it was supposed to do. Now, you could look at that and say, well, that's kind of a small beer victory, right? We just got them to do what they were supposed to do. But the thing is, they weren't doing it. Right. They were giving the chemical industry a free pass on these chemicals. These are things like the forever chemicals known as PFASs, things that we know from other research are desperately dangerous to human health and the environment more generally. So I consider this one a win for independent investigative journalism, and one where, a salute to government employed whistleblowers who call out wrongdoing when they see it. That's the people at PEER, Sharon Lerner at The Intercept, E.A. Crunden at E&E News, all deserve our props, I think, right?
Absolutely. And this may go outside of your the research you've done, but do you want to venture a guess as to why the EPA has failed in this regard? Is it simply they've been captured by these companies largely?
Yeah, I mean, those are the key words, right? Regulatory capture. And I think the industry influence on government regulatory agencies is always going to be an issue. But I think it's no coincidence also that the EPA stopped reporting while the Trump administration was under control. This isn't to say that I have a lot more faith in Democrat leaders to bolster our governmental regulatory agencies, but we know that one of the speaking for myself now, that one of the aims of the Republican Party is to dismantle regulatory agencies in the name of promoting good business and so forth. And those are, in my opinion, ultimately very selfish and antisocial and short-sighted aims. So again, that's me layering on a level of interpretation that isn't in the original reporting by Lerner or Crunden. but that certainly fits with larger patterns that we've seen over the years at Project Censored.
Yeah, and it's the same with a lot of these regulatory agencies. When they do what they're supposed to do, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, I mean, that I think so. One of the challenge, I think there's a double-edged challenge there. Is one, I don't think we want to do away with those regulatory agencies.
Right.
The Wild West version, of unregulated industry is not, that's a kind of dystopian future, even if it's not the same as a zombie apocalypse. But on the other hand, I think the existence of these regulatory agencies shouldn't make us complacent, right? Had it not been for independent investigative journalism and a lawsuit filed on, using Freedom of Information Act resources by peer, right? Probably these Section 80 reports would still be getting, buried.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we need those government regulatory agencies, but we also need external, like third parties, to ensure that they're working the way they're supposed to work, right? And so whistleblowers are key, investigative journalism is key. And also, just to lay it on a little more, an informed and proactive public is also important, right? This is a story that a lot of people are of course, we know the EPA is really in the pocket, right? I'm kind of cynical. Nothing new here, and I think that's that's a way in which we have to be careful that our cynicism doesn't play into the hands of our enemies.
Very true, and in terms of the EPA stepping up occasionally, but it's pretty rare. They just canceled the Pebble Mine project, massive mining project in Alaska. And apparently it's like the third time, I think, in their history that they've stopped a large mining or drilling operation. And so it's rare, but it's still a win.
Yeah, that's a major win. That's a major win. If you go and read about what the Pebble Mine project would entail, and it's probably even with that ruling, it's probably not a done deal, right? There is a zombie-like quality to some of these battles. There will be another round of challenges to that. But if you go and look at what Pebble Mine proposes to do, and the tiny financial benefits to the people with interests in the project versus the incredible risks that everyone else who's not profiting from the project is exposed to. It's insane.
Yeah. Let's move on to number 8 on your list, which I have covered a few times through the past couple of years, but incredibly important story that the CIA discussed plans to kidnap or kill Julian Assange.
Yeah. This is one of those stories that when it showed up on our story list as a candidate for the top 25, internally, the discussion we were having was there's no way this story is going to make the top 25 list. So major corporate news outlets will cover it, right? And that's one of the criteria. If major news outlets have covered it in a way that is commensurate with the story's significance, we don't include it on the Project Censored top 25 story list. So this was one that I thought, the language we use is metaphoric, but I thought for sure this story was going to get killed in terms of being a candidate for the top 25 story list. But lo and behold, it made it. I'll mention some about the corporate news coverage in a moment, but just for people who haven't already heard about this, this is based on reporting by Mike Isikoff and a team of reporters at Yahoo News who talked to 30-some top-level U.S. government officials back in the time period. They talked to them about events in the government around late 2017 when Mike Pompeo was director of the CIA, and a number of those high-level government officials told Isikoff and the Yahoo News team reporting the story that there were discussions of either outright assassinating Assange or kidnapping him, and that these discussions were part of what Yahoo News reported as an unprecedented CIA campaign against Assange. There were, as one of a former counterterrorism official, who's one of their sources for this story, said, there appeared to be no boundaries on what the highest level people would entertain in terms of plots against Assange. So this just goes to show, I think, the animus that the U.S. government has towards Assange. And, it's beyond the desire to extradite him and try him under the Espionage Act, which is something that, if it happens, will be historically unprecedented. No publisher has ever been tried under the Espionage Act in the U.S.
So especially a non-American.
Yeah, right, exactly. Although it's very interesting. I learned about this from Kevin Gosztola, Shadowproof, who has a book coming out with the Censored Press this month called Guilty of Journalism, which is, it's been called Assange 101 by some pretty high profile people. And
he's done great work.
Kevin pointed out to me that a number of the U.S. congressional leaders who squawk the loudest for bringing Assange to the U.S. and trying him under the Espionage Act talk about Assange as if he's a U.S. citizen. Right. We're going to bring him back, right? And as Kevin points out in Guilty of Journalism, this forthcoming book of his, there's evidence, I think, that Assange has maybe visited the U.S. a couple times.
Yeah, never operated. WikiLeaks was never here. Yeah.
So it's not just it's not just that the corporate media have probably misinformed the U.S. public about who Assange is and what WikiLeaks does. It's also the case that our elected officials, in the highest level of the legislature, don't apparently understand who it is they're talking about. So that's a sidebar to the reporting from the Yahoo News story. But I want to go back and mention just that Yahoo News story did get traction in places like The Hill. Rolling Stone did an article. But when we looked at corporate news media coverage of Assange, of the story, the only mention we found was a passing reference in an October 2021 New York Times article that only made mention. The only people mentioning the plot to kill Assange, right? The CIA high-level discussions about killing or kidnapping Assange came from Assange's lawyers, and they were quoted referring to that as grounds on which Assange should not be extradited to the U.S. Right? That we couldn't trust if the U.S. was willing to plan with the U.K. government running gun battles through the streets of London to get Assange, he probably wasn't going to fare well in the hands of the U.S. government after being extradited. But that was the only
delivering him to his would-be killers.
Yeah. So it was stunning to me when we found so little corporate news coverage, and that the only, had Assange's lawyers not mentioned that, there would have been nothing in the nation's most prestigious newspapers about this.
Yeah, I mean, truly egregious, and yeah, it's gotten such little coverage, but so much about Assange has gotten such little coverage, and I'm glad you say Kevin's coming out with that book, because if you look at the mainstream media, I know that what's his name, Jim Acosta, came out with a book titled "A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth," and in it, there's no mention of Assange. And when he was pressed on that in one of his press conferences to support his book about how dangerous it is to tell the truth, he meant because of Trump. When he was pressed on Assange, he essentially tried to not answer. And then when he was pressed further, he said, the way I understand it, he's a hacker or something. I don't know. I don't really know much about that. And I'm like, you're putting out a book called A Dangerous Time to Tell the Truth, and you're not speaking of one of the most famous publishers in the world who's being persecuted and tortured by America.
Yeah. So it epitomizes these gaps, these pitfalls in corporate news media coverage, right? And I think I think this goes to bigger issues about how the corporate media have very narrow definitions of who and what count as newsworthy, right? And so the Washington Post and the New York Times were happy to win awards based on awards for reporting based on documents that WikiLeaks made public.
Yeah.
But when it comes time to talk about Assange as a publisher, they're ready to shoot the messenger, right? So, I mean, I think, in some cases, in some ways, that book is a benign example. At least he wasn't trash talking Assange and WikiLeaks, right? He just ignored it. That's
Right.
bad enough. But I mean, I think the hypocrisy of some of the major establishment newspapers to report on the basis of things WikiLeaks has exposed, and then to talk about Assange the way they do, is just it's hypocrisy, and it makes it's not another kind of case in point, I think, for the notions that all the news that's fit to print, the New York Times slogan, or democracy dies in the dark, the kind of Washington Post Trump era marketing point. Like, we need to think about those, like turning those points back around at the organizations themselves, right? Kevin makes a great point, the kind of concluding point of his book, which people should read his book when it comes out, because he makes it more eloquently than I'll put it now, is that in an age of digital media and social media in particular, the challenges that the U.S. would put, the challenges that the U.S. is putting to Assange as a publisher actually implicate all of us, right? Because when I go on my social media and I post, an article from Mint Press News, in some sense, I too am, even though I'm effectively doing so as a private citizen, I am in some sense a publisher. And maybe I'm posting something that whatever government is in power at the time thinks is incendiary or falls under the purview of the Espionage Act. So the implications of the case against Assange go far beyond what's going to happen to him personally, although that's a matter of human rights concern itself, beyond WikiLeaks, even beyond the future of journalism, as if that's not big enough. I think Kevin Gosztola makes the great point that, all of us are potentially at one point or another in our daily routines publishers, and the effort, the political case against Assange can have chilling effects on a much larger group of people as a result.
Let's jump to major media outlets lobby against regulation of surveillance advertising. This is something I really didn't know much about.
This one, unfortunately, is kind of the counterpoint.
Well, folks, he got cut off, but I don't think I did that. I hope when he logs back in, he says that was his fault and not mine. Or maybe that was the fault of the people we've been talking about. You can't talk that long about Assange.
Sorry, Lee. I think I lost contact with you there for a moment. Are we back in order?
You are back, and I was hoping that wasn't my fault.
No, I'm not quite sure what happened. Maybe the major media outlets didn't like me talking about.
It could have been the CIA. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. This story, unfortunately, I think this story is kind of a counterpoint to the one we were talking about a moment ago. That was sort of like the power of independent investigative journalism to do things. This is sort of about the craven irresponsibility of the corporate media to report things that to report on issues that reflect poorly on them, which perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that they do this, but that's what this story is all about. So I think the notion of surveillance advertising won't be a new one to people listening to or following Behind the Headlines. But just in case, the idea of surveillance advertising is that anytime we're online, our activities are being monitored so that we can be targeted with advertising that reflects my particular interests and demographics and whatnot. And there are companies like OpenX and Oracle Kai Blue, Oracle Blue Kai, that specialize in doing that kind of analysis and providing it to potential advertisers to profit from. So back, let's see, I'm not sure exactly when this began, but the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has started to attempt to regulate surveillance advertising. And it's meeting predictable opposition, but with some interesting characters lurking behind the scenes. So the opposition is coming to the FTC's attempts to regulate surveillance advertising. It's coming from the Interactive Advertising Bureau, which is a kind of a network that represents the interests of major media outlets that use digital advertising. So in terms of news and journalism, this is organizations like CNN, the New York Times, Fox News, the Washington Post, NBC, the list goes on and on. So the IAB, the Interactive Advertising Bureau, represents all these news organizations. And as Li Feng of The Intercept reported, the IAB has spent like $160,000 in lobbying money to oppose FTC regulation of surveillance advertising. So the kicker on this is the depending on your point of view, the really rich or bitter part of this is, as Li Feng points out, no corporate news outlets have reported on the IAB's opposition to FTC regulation of surveillance advertising, right, because it would involve calling themselves out, right? They would have to acknowledge that they themselves work with this entity and profit from surveillance advertising themselves. So I know in these times where we're so sensitive to language, we're supposed to be careful with how we talk about things, but this always strikes me as a blind spot. And I don't mean to disparage people with sight disabilities, but a blind spot like we have in our automobiles, right? Where you can be driving along and you look in your mirror and you think, oh, everything's cool, I'll change lanes. And suddenly smack, you hit something because there was a spot in your rear view that you couldn't see because of how the car is built or whatever. And so in that sense, I think this is a brilliant example of a corporate media blind spot that is structurally like motivated by how corporate media work.
Yeah. And you know, in the larger sense, I think people don't understand how harmful advertising is to our society. So then when you add in surveillance advertising, where they can watch everything you do and know what type of person you are and know exactly how to bing various sensors in your brain to get you to do things. Advertising is incredibly nefarious and tenacious and pernicious. And like, you know, they've shown that if people, even when they know something's false, if they are shown it many, many times, they'll confuse familiarity with truth. Well, now take that for every product, every brand, every device, everything that tells you how great it is or how wonderful it is. Well, we start to confuse that with truth, even if initially we were like, oh, that's just trying to manipulate me.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, we have to talk about advertising in the broader context of a culture of consumerism, right? And again, this won't be news to anyone who regularly pays attention to your program, Lee. But the idea that we find fulfillment in our identities, right? We form our identities. We find fulfillment in life through the consumption of goods and services is a huge ideological construct.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's something that goes to the heart of what Project Censored, I think, aims to do, which is to encourage people to develop their critical media literacy. And so thinking critically about advertising, thinking critically about how social media really you couldn't have invented something better to promote and expand the culture of consumerism than something like Instagram, right?
Right.
And because what does it do? It encourages us to think in exactly those terms. And then the other thing that it does, I think, is it encourages us to do all that quickly, right?
Right.
To engage at a fast rate. Part of what social media does, and this is maybe this is just a new form of peer pressure in some cases, but like if I don't like my friend's post quickly enough, what do they begin interpreting about me? Am I mad at them? Am I not as cool as they thought I was? And so there's a pressure on people not only to engage in, to engage advertising, to reproduce this culture of consumerism, but to do so at an increasingly rapid pace. I had the good fortune of getting to be the co-author of a new book about critical media literacy for young people called The Media and Me, jointly published by the Censored Press, the publishing imprint of Project Censored, and Seven Stories Press in New York. And we have a chapter in The Media and Me all about advertising and consumer culture. The book is targeted towards young people, but I think there are lessons in it that are useful for all of us.
Yeah.
And one of those lessons is like, be careful about how fast you engage, right? That in some sense serves powers that many of us are opposed to. And slowing down, hard though it may be on a kind of experiential level, is often a more effective way of engaging. So
I'm glad you bring that up about how we've been kind of socially engineered to believe there is some sort of self-worth in our purchasing and our consuming. And people always love to say, "Oh, it's social engineering," when on other things, but they never stop and look at the ways we are socially engineered currently. It takes an immense amounts of social engineering to make us think that our passion in life is what type of towels we buy. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or for that matter, what brand of news we pay attention to, if we pay attention to any news at all, right? Think about the identities that are fabricated in terms of, oh, well, I can't talk to him, he listens to Fox, right? Or don't even talk about Russia with her. She's a Rachel Maddow MSNBC person, right? And I think, I would add maybe one more point on that, which is, we could talk about this all day long. But I think, corporate news is also packaged in ways to prey on that social engineering, right? Think about how much of the news is negative, right? It invokes fear responses.
Yep.
And again, that's kind of like critical media literacy 101, right? How do you hook people, right? But I think, part of what the crisis of corporate media right now is people are fed up with that, right? We know that public trust in the US in news is at an all-time low. I'm always wanting to point out when people point to those Pew Research studies showing lack of public trust in news. When you look at Pew Research and who they count as news when they poll people, with the exception of one or two outlets, they're all corporate news outlets. So really what we're saying is public trust in corporate news is at an all-time low. Right. But that's still a problem, because if that's what people believe to be the news and they're turning away from it, we have an increasingly uninformed populace that, again, serves forces that we're trying to oppose, right? Counter-democratic forces that it's their wildest dream to have a stupid public that will respond to the latest moral panic in just the predictable ways that they hope. So I think one of the issues,
and respond within the acceptable breadth of debate, the acceptable parameters,
the predictable. Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things is we have to cultivate public trust in and support for independent news that provides alternatives to the narrow, constrictive definitions of who and what count as newsworthy that we get from the corporate media.
Speaking of not trusting the corporate media, I'll throw this one in there. Number 7, concerns for journalistic independence as the Gates Foundation gives $319 million to news outlets.
Yeah, this is Alan McLeod doing some deep investigative reporting for Mint Press News. He went back and looked at years and years of grants provided by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to all kinds of news-related organizations, not just in the US, but around the world. And Alan McLeod's conclusion is that, not to say that, oh, it's bad that Gates is funding journalism, but that the Gates money is so widely spread that there are incredible conflicts of interest. I'll paraphrase this again. Alan McLeod has it worded more eloquently than I'll relay it now. But he talks in the article, the Mint Press News article, about this story, about how it's possible that a journalist could be trained in a journalism program funded by Gates money. They could be then hired by a news outlet that is receiving Gates Foundation money, and they could be covering a topic on which the Gates Foundation has provided funding to promote coverage of that topic. And that may sound too abstract, but one of the examples that Alan McLeod dug up is how in Texas, Gates Foundation money supported news reporting on school choice initiatives, which Bill Gates is known as an advocate of school choice. And so that raises serious questions about what kind of reporting will we get when we have a Gates-funded reporter at a Gates-funded institution, news outlet, reporting on a topic where we know the Gates Foundation has positions of its own.
And is school choice a euphemistic term for destroying public schools?
Right. Yeah, exactly. In a nutshell, yes, right. School choice. I mean, that's a larger conversation that deserves to take place. But certainly, Project Censored over the years has reported a number of times on how policies to promote school choice are in effect undermining public education with all of the social justice implications that entails, and also often includes an anti-union component as well.
Let's jump to number 15. The EarnIt Act threatens online freedom of expression under guise of policing child pornography, which I feel like we're hearing this more and more about various assaults on our liberties or our privacy under the guise of, well, it's going to stop a pedophile.
Yeah. Moral panics, right? Moral panics make for good news and often can fuel public support for legislation that would restrict freedom of information and freedom of expression. So, it seems like you can't have a bill in Congress these days without, extraordinary acronyms. Right. The EarnIt Act is the Eliminating Abusive and Rampant Neglect of Interactive Technologies. And really what it is it's a threat to online freedom of expression under the guise of protecting people from the negative consequences of child pornography. So the idea behind the EarnIt Act is that we will withdraw Section 230 protections from the Communications Decency Act for any online platform that is seen to host CSAM, child sex abuse material. So let me back up a minute. Section 230 provides an important protection for online platforms that they can't be held liable except under specific circumstances for the content that people post on their platform. And again, this is something we could have productive public debates about. but we probably aren't going to when stories like this get deep-sixed by the corporate media. But anyway, if you say now anything that looks like child porn, it makes online platforms vulnerable to legal responsibility for things that people have published on their website. The chilling effect of that is potentially huge. And this is not me saying this. This is everyone from the human rights organization Article 19 to the Electronic Frontier Foundation to Stanford's Internet Observatory and a host of other kind of online freedom of information, freedom of expression advocates. The fear is that it will lead online platforms to use an overbroad understanding of what could constitute CSAM. This has differential impacts on different groups of people. And what Article 19 and a number of the other organizations that I just mentioned and more have all noted is that the impacts of this on LGBTQ communities will be profound, because LGBTQ content is often flagged inappropriately as being sexually explicit. And so the kind of chilling effects of this are one significant concern. The other element of this story that I think is really important is, and this is something that the Stanford Internet Observatory has been outspoken on, is really you can think of the EarnIt Act as an effort to do away with end-to-end encryption on the internet. So what's end-to-end encryption? End-to-end encryption protects our privacy when we're communicating and doing things on the internet. And it's essential not just to historically marginalized groups like members of LGBTQ communities and so forth, but also to journalists who rely on end-to-end encryption to talk in confidentiality with their sources. And the way the EarnIt Act would would in effect kill end-to-end encryption is that end-to-end encryption is currently treated as a red flag for child sexual abuse materials. So whenever law enforcement agencies see end-to-end encryption working, they're concerned that that raises the possibility that maybe that end-to-end encryption is being used to cover up illegal behavior. But again, there's this kind of, the problem is an overbroad interpretation of that. So we have other tools that can allow us to track CSAM. We don't have better tools now than end-to-end encryption for protecting all users' privacy when they're engaging in activity online. And so there are major concerns, I think, about what the EarnIt Act would do beyond what it claims it does, right? So this is an example, I think, of a kind of a Trojan horse type logic operating in corporate news coverage. Again, this story is on our list, on the Project Censored Top 25 story list for the year, because it has received little to no corporate news coverage. In this case, we did find some corporate news coverage of the EarnIt Act, but a lot of it was presented by the most prestigious newspapers in the country as matters of opinion. So the coverage appears not on the front pages of the paper, but back in the op-ed section. One example, a Washington Post editorial on this talked about how there were dangerous trade-offs in the EarnIt Act, but did not talk in detail about the threats to end-to-end encryption. We found coverage in the Wall Street Journal that the main point the Wall Street Journal took away from debates over end-to-end encryption was the lack of debate. They were happy to report that there was bipartisan support in Congress for the EarnIt Act, but made little to no mention of all these civil society groups that are advocates of freedom of information and freedom of expression, and all basically the alarm bells that they're sounding, saying, wait a minute, we've done this before, And now we're doing it again, and it's just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than it was in its previous incarnation.
And it also feels like they just like to anything that kind of the ruling elite want to stop. They just say, "Oh, it facilitates pedophilia or something," when of course pedophilia is highly illegal. And just because something, I'm sure it was easier once there were telephones to coordinate pedophile rings, but that doesn't mean you make telephones illegal. But they like to say, "Oh, Bitcoin is used for drugs and stuff." Well, it's still, the number one thing used for drug sales, cash. So we don't make cash illegal. So it just seems like it's used as a way to make things illegal or to allow them to stop various tools that they don't like. I don't want to run out of time before I ask you about something else you speak about in the book, which is, and I guess the Assange topic is kind of on this thread, but just attacks on journalism in general over the past year.
Yeah, a major threat to journalists. This is a global phenomenon, and Reporters Without Borders not too long ago came out with their annual roundup of all the documented assaults and threats against journalists in a global perspective. And I believe the figure was something like 553 journalists detained worldwide last year, 57 killed, 65 held hostage, 49 missing, can't be accounted for. So the world is an increasingly dangerous place for journalists. And as Heidi Bogosian points out in the foreword to State of the Free Press 2023, the number of the uptick in violence against journalists in the U.S. is also significant. It was in September of last year, 2022, that a longtime investigative reporter at the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Jeff German, was killed in his home by a public official who German was actively investigating and reporting on at the time. Not many people know that, I think. And so there's a sense, I think, in the United States that, journalists are subject to physical threats and harassing lawsuits and other forms of intimidation to try to get them not to do their jobs. That happens overseas, right? That happens in places like Mexico, or Brazil, or Eastern Europe. But not here. And anyone who thinks that would be well advised to check out the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker online, which documents in a thorough and systemic way assaults on journalists in the U.S. Everything from having a journalist having their equipment broken, to their being arrested and detained by law enforcement, to in this case, Jeff German, they're losing their lives for reporting the truth. And so this is something that we aren't exceptional on. It's here too. And obviously, when you kill journalists, that's the ultimate form of censorship, right? You silence the source.
And the amount of beatings and arrests where they don't necessarily keep charges against them, but they just arrest them and hold them for a couple of days. It goes on constantly in the United States by police against people who have identified themselves as some level of press or were holding up a phone trying to film police. I had friends at the George Floyd protests in Washington, D.C. when we were there who were hit with rubber bullets. One had her hip or something around there broken by cops stomping on her, and they knew she was press. It was very clear. She's holding a lanyard showing them she's press, and they attack her.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Lee. And again, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker documents these rigorously. And it's absolutely true that since the killing of George Floyd, places like Black Lives Matter rallies and demonstrations, as well as election campaign events, have been very dangerous places for U.S. journalists to do their jobs. And they've been at risk not only from members of the public. But as you point out, a number of those cases are at the hands of law enforcement officers of one type or another. So if we talk about, notions of, well, the First Amendment that protects freedom of the press from government incursion, when we're talking about law enforcement officers restricting the ability of people who actively have press credentials, right, who are clearly holding cameras that identify them as members of the press, these are dark warning signs for anyone who's concerned about the state of the free press in the United States today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me. Tell people again, well, it's projectcensored.org, but anything else they should know about following the work of Project Censored, grabbing the book, etc.
Yeah, well, check out State of the Free Press 2023. You can also have a look for The Media and Me, our guide to critical media literacy for young people. Each of those you can ask for at your local independent bookshop or order directly from projectcensored.org. Book sales help support our hands-on critical media literacy training programs for young people.
Thank you so much, Andy, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Keep up the excellent work.
Right on. Thanks a bunch, Lee. Take care.
Thanks. All right, there it is, folks. Another stellar interview, and I think I'm allowed to say that because I'm not giving myself the credit. I give the awesome guests the credit. Andy Lee Roth, Project Censored. If you don't know Project Censored, you should by now. Definitely check it out. Have as a bookmark tab on your homepage, and definitely grab the book as well. Even if you already know the top 25, it helps support all of their work. So definitely do that. Also, we are completely independently funded. So if you want to see the interviews like this continue, if you want to see behind the headlines continue despite all of the suppression, which is mammoth, please go to patreon.com/behind the headlines. You can support us there. You can get, I think they have some merch there. They have a blooper reel of my presentations of Most Censored News, the cuts that did not make it in the final episode, which I didn't ask them to put that up there. It's just fucking there, and now you get it if you sign up. I'm just kidding, but thanks again to Andy Lee Roth, Project Censored, and I will see you soon with another episode. And there is a new episode of Most Censored News that you can check out right now, detailing how America is the true rogue nation in the world, the true nation out of line with every other country globally. Check that out at youtube.com/behind the headlines. Keep fighting.